a professor. She worked across Canada, England, the United States, Spain, and South Africa. Sorry. She was a member of the Canadian Royal Academy of Arts, and she painted for over 40 years. And her work has been shown, well, as also Sonia highlighted, in some exhibitions in many major institutions internationally. You could have seen her work at the Venice Biennial, at the Arsenale this year. I'm going to show some of them here. Yeah, there they are. Sorry. Yeah. And then at the Tate Britain as part of Women in Revolt. Currently, she has a solo exhibition at Confederation Centre of the Arts in Charlottetown on Prince Edward Island in Canada, and that's where Erica spent 2 last decades of her life. In terms of the style, it ranged from abstract expressionism in her early works from the 60s, to pop art inspired artworks that are also on view here at the gallery, her self-portraits and landscapes. Works in the 70s also signaled her gender transition that was happening during the same time period. And finally, like dreamlike modernism that we see in this room from her latest series of the Human Comedy. So please, as during our discussion, think about any comments or questions you might have, and we're going to leave some time for them at the end. So my first question is for both Gemma and Linsey. So how did you first come across Erica Rutherford's work?
Well, I'm much newer to it than you are, because it's partly thanks to you that I have discovered it. So yeah, really I've become familiar with Erica's work this year, having seen it in Venice and then in your show, and then Richard Saltoun Gallery announcing that this show is coming up as well. And yeah, I've been really delighted to learn about it, and in terms of getting to know more about Erica's life and quite long practice as well. I'm in the process of going on a bit of a deep dive because I'm working on a new book, and Erica will be one of the included artists. But yeah, really it's been thanks to the brilliant exhibitions that have been including her work this year.
Yeah, for me it was very much about Neve from Richard Saltoun. So one of the directors here who, when you're a curator, as you'll well know, you have a kind of network of people that you trust, that you kind of go to kind of sound out ideas with. And I'd been talking about Women in Revolt and how I wanted to make sure that we had a real breadth. It wasn't about finding people who were unknown. It wasn't that kind of weird digging people out. But I really wanted to make sure we'd been thorough. And I wanted the show to be trans inclusive. And I kind of didn't also, and I mean this in a serious way, I didn't want to make a fuss about that. I just wanted to include trans women artists. But I really, this might be the next question, so maybe I won't go into that yet. But so it was Neve. So I'd said to lots of my friends and colleagues, you know, if you come across work that you think I'm interested in by any artist from that period, please let me know. And I got this really frantic call from Neve being like, oh my expletive God, I've just found this incredible artist. And she had been looking at, I think, auction sales and seen a painting she loved, which I think, do you want to tell me? Maybe go back to the Venice, it wasn't the diver, I think it was maybe this one, go back please, Daria, thank you. I think it was the coat. Or it was one that looked very similar and it had come up at auction, and she had found out about it, and then the auction catalogue, some very fabulous researcher had written about 100 words on Erica and spoken about her gender affirmation surgery and things, so she knew that this was a very unusual artist to have come across. And then we both ordered this book, which I urge you to get. It is a romp through the life of Erica Rutherford. It is not particularly art historically useful, but it's kind of fabulous. And she wrote it herself near the end of her life. And then, so Neve had been in touch with the family, and then I got in touch with the family, and it was just through lots of conversations with them.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that. And so, can you tell us a bit more about your experience of researching and curating Erica's work for the Women in Revolt? In particular, well, you partly answered that, why her inclusion was significant for you for this exhibition, and how did you decide which works to include?
Yeah, so it's a really significant inclusion, and I think it's a very, when you make an exhibition at a show somewhere like the Tate, it's very, very public, and we were certainly in the middle of the culture wars and kind of thinking about how you make a show like that will land well with audiences, but will respect artists and will respect the kind of the art historical narratives of the time, but also of now. So it was a really complicated set of things to kind of bring together. And there's something that I talk about quite a lot, which was this really interesting day where I'd done a lot of research with the LGBTQ+I groups at Tate, and I think I mentioned this to you, that I did one particular presentation about 3 years before the show opened, and everyone in the room, so everyone under 30 was furious with me, because there weren't yet trans women artists in the show. I hadn't found any, and they thought I was just being lazy because there must be loads, and I just was not trying to find them. And then everyone kind of over 40 was like, okay, because they lived through Section 28, they understood the kind of context of hostility and violence in the UK. So there was a really interesting process of trying to, come together as a group and kind of share experience and talk about why it might be that there would be a great deal of visibility in the UK of trans women artists. And in that process of researching, I was thinking about it today and looking back at it. And I would love to know more, so if anyone has people that I missed or we missed, we'd love to know. But I found Jane Country, the musician, punk, who I was just dying to find a painting. I was like, please let there be one, but I couldn't find one. And then Judy Cousins. So Judy Cousins is a really interesting artist. So she was described as a golfer and sculptor, which is a kind of fabulous combination. And Judy set up the Self-Help Association, and excuse this language, this is historic language and not language I would use now, but the Self-Help Association for Transsexuals, also known as SHAFT. And apparently she didn't think that was funny at all. She thought it was like absolutely legit to call SHAFT. And I got really excited when I found Judy's work, and then went on a deep dive and found that actually she was a Tory, and she loved Margaret Thatcher and had made loads and loads of busts of Margaret and Dennis Thatcher, and that was the only thing that was going to be available. And obviously, it was a very anti-Thatcher show, so that wasn't going to work. So it ended up that Erica was the only trans woman artist in the show, and I picked what her family called the trans hard edge work, which is the work that you'll see on this. When there is a lot of abstract work and then later these more stylistic works, and I chose these because she painted them about her gender affirmation process in the 1970s, and I didn't want, if she hadn't spoken about that, I wouldn't have included them, because I wanted it to be a very safe space for people, the artists and their legacies. And sorry, I'm rambling on and on.
No, it's interesting.
So one of the things I was really conscious about, I included the Beaumont Bulletin. I got the archives from Bishopsgate, and I felt it was really important to keep them closed, because when they're open, there's these absolutely gorgeous images of women cross-dressing, and it just felt too exposing. It felt really uncomfortable to put those women in a vitrine at Tate, and it felt really uncomfortable. So I got permission from the Beaumont Bulletin to put them in at all. I wouldn't have done it without their permission. And then we have them closed, so you just saw the covers. So it was about leading people to a history and then showing them that they could find it, rather than just swaggering about as an institution and kind of exposing things that you found. So it was quite a delicate process.
But I think it's really interesting how you to include Erica's work and think so carefully and sensitively about how she would have talked about that work. And then you've also got, as in that same show, you had Della Grace Volcano, for example, who is an intersex, gender non-conforming artist who is very, very open about their gender identity. I've heard them speaking multiple times about that, and that's, you know, someone making work 10, 20, 30 years later. And so I think having those as 2 points of conversation in terms of the context for gender identity is
It's only about 6 years later. Because Dell's, the work by Dell was 81. Yeah, it was really early.
That's true.
Which is fascinating as well.
Right. To it's a very different approach.
Yeah, and like Dell was in London, obviously Chain Reaction's not till 89, but even in those early 80s days was very much involved in the Bell and like all the kind of club scene around that. And if Erica had come back from holiday, you know, because she'd moved abroad by then, she could have kind of been connected to those scenes too.
Yeah. But I also wonder if I wonder if she, from what I know so far, which is a lot less than you about Erica, I do wonder if she would have been involved in those scenes anyway.
No, and I think that's hugely important.
She seems so different.
I think it's hugely important, and I think it's hugely important to celebrate the broader context of the work and not just this incredible trans hard edge work, but I think the full scope of her career is really fascinating.
Yeah.
Sorry.
That's great. No, it's great. So my next question is for Gemma. So you recently published the book Queer Art that Sonia mentioned that celebrates the massive global impact of LGBTQI+ artists, and you are currently working on a new book that's going to feature Erica Rutherford, and you are actively curating shows featuring queer artists. So what challenges do you encounter in your mission to promote visibility for transgender artists?
Yeah, it's a good question because there are lots of challenges. So yeah, when I wrote the book, I knew it was going to be the first queer art book that had come out in a long time, in over a decade, and I really, really wanted to make sure that I had really good representation of trans and gender non-conforming artists in the book. And I'd say one of the biggest challenges in terms of kind of doing that is finding the artists. You know, thinking historically, is finding the artists. So in the end, there are nearly 200 artists in the book, and I think it's about 40 of them, 35, 40 of the artists in the book identify as trans, non-binary, or gender non-conforming. But the percentage of the artists really increases as we get closer to today. And so I think, you know, and this speaks to your point as well, thinking about finding trans-identifying artists through art history, it is challenging because so many trans people were not able to live as their true selves, as this kind of first point. But then the context, you know, it was very often, the further back you go, not safe for people to live openly and freely, and for that identity expression to then be visible in the work. You know, like this body of work of Erica's, for example, I would say is very coded in the way it speaks about gender identity. You know, once you know the story and the context, I think it's, you know, it's really powerful work to think about that, to think about what was happening in her personal life and how that's coming through in the work. But it's harder to find that information. You know, really, I think Linsey's story about it all beginning with the secondary market moment, somebody, thank goodness, in the auction house doing really good research and including that in the catalogue. And actually even the fact that that came up at auction more recently, because I would say 10 years ago, the researcher, the cataloguer probably would not want to include that information in
Such a good point.
because when and then I think this is my second. So my first point is about kind of finding the artists. I think my second point is about the art market and the commercial support for artists. And, you know, if that artwork had come up at auction 10, 15 years ago, there would have been a reluctance to talk about trans identity, because it's really, you know, in the last decade or so, we're seeing an increased demand, thank goodness, to acknowledge what is happening in terms of an artist's gender identity and sexuality, and think about how an understanding of that may enrich our understanding of the work. And that's something that, you know, with my book, I have thought about a lot and spoken about a lot. You know, when I was putting together this book of queer art, of course, through the process of image licensing, we spoke with every artist and their estate to make sure that they were comfortable being grouped under this umbrella of queer art. And there were, you know, like a handful, maybe 4 or 5 artists that did not want to be included in a book about queer art. And usually that was because of where they live in the world. Perhaps it's not safe for them to be out. And then in 1 or 2 cases, the artist was worried that it would be pigeonholing or it would be in some way reductive. But the other artists, the nearly 200 in the book, all said, you know, thank goodness somebody is finally acknowledging the queerest parts of me. You know, and that was artists like Nicole Eisenman, who are very, very successful in terms of collections and museum representation and commercially. And a lot of artists said, yeah, you know, I'm glad that I'm able to be viewed in this way. And so I think, you know, when it comes to thinking about an artist's identity, talking about queer and trans lived experience and how that might be expressed in the art, I think that it's only ever going to be one of the lenses that we can apply to the work. I think it can be a very valuable lens. I know for myself, you know, as a young queer person just arriving in London doing an MA in art history at the Courtauld, when I started to see queer women, particularly in art, in galleries, I found it very validating, and it really helped me make sense of my own identity. And so I think being able to have that conversation around the work is really, really valuable. But I don't think it should take away from all the other things that are going on in the work. You know, that artist can still be a fantastic painter, a female artist, a surrealist, you know, whatever it might be, an artist. Those things are all relevant. But, you know, I work a lot, the curatorial work that I do is mostly contemporary work that I work with. And I would say that with the artists that I work with, particularly trans femme artists actually, I think that a real challenge is that the commercial part of the art world fails the artists. I really think that. And so many of the artists that I work with have had an interaction with a commercial gallery, may have even been represented, and there's maybe been 1 or 2 shows where it's gone well, but a lot of artists have told me stories about how they've just really struggled to get the support that they need for their brilliant work from the commercial galleries that they're working with. And you know, success for artists looks like lots of different things. It's not just about commercial success. However, that commercial success is important because artists should be able to make a living from the work that they make. So yeah, that I would say that's kind of the second challenge I did. What was the other one? And then I think the third one, which I know we're going to talk about a bit more later, is just thinking about once we've found those artists, how we're writing about them or how we are curating their work, and thinking about where the identity comes in, where it's relevant to talk about it, what is safe or sensitive for the artist, what feels relevant to the audience. You know, I think that's needs to be very nuanced.
Yeah, I guess we're going to come to that to talk about it in more details. I want to ask Linsey about this incredible mural that a couple of years ago was placed on a building in downtown Charlottetown. So it's a town where Erica spent last around 20 years of her life. And this is a reproduction of one of her best known paintings, We Can't All Be Perfect. And so as you work very closely with your family, I wanted to ask you, like, what was the significance of Erica's work for the communities at the time in Charlottetown, and also for the emerging generation of artists today? And just to follow up on that, like, did she feel support by the community at the time? Did you get like an understanding of that from her family or friends?
So I haven't been yet, so I'm trying to get funding at the moment to go. I want to go and look in the archives. But this is Susan, her daughter, and Gail, her wife. They split up when in the 70s when Erica had her gender affirmation surgery, but they stayed incredibly close. I think they stayed married, but were separated romantically. And they both look after the estate and are deeply committed to it. And I think, I don't know, it's hard. When we started first talking about this, we were saying to Daria, it's actually really difficult because so little is known about the work. Or, you know, we've got this amazing book, which is really kind of dramatic. But actually, in terms of art criticism or in terms of really close readings, they're not there yet. They just don't exist. Juliette Jakes wrote for the Women in Revolt catalogue, and I asked her to write a little bit about Erica. But again, for Juliette, it was really hard to find stuff. So that's why I want to go to the archive and talk to people and get involved. But she was very much loved within the community. So it's a very small town in a place called Charlottetown in Prince Edward Island. And I'm from a really rural place in Scotland, so this kind of blew my mind that a very small town would have been so embracing. But it seems they absolutely were to Erica's work. What I found interesting about this is that Erica, so I'm going to pass this round. So this is, it's very hard to find these otherwise. These are images from the family of her early work. So they're works from like the 60s and 70s, which are these kind of abstract, quite wonderful, but sort of moody British painting. I think this is the Arts Council work, I think.
I'm not sure, yeah.
But there is a work in the Arts Council collection which is still attributed to Erica Rutherford. So I checked today, so I'm going to have to email them because I thought it had been changed, but it hasn't. And yeah, you'll see it's a very, very different style of work. And then there's this trans hard edge series from the kind of, for probably about 8 years, I think it's about, in the 70s. And then it's those gorgeous kind of really stylized images of cats, of windows. She was obsessed with cats, of landscape, and then these more trippy kind of late ones. So I think the reaction or the relationship with the community would have been largely seen through the images of the town, the images of the landscape, and of these works. So they obviously have embraced the work, the trans hard edge work, because they've put it up in the hall. But I get the sense that they saw Erica as a rounded woman that they loved in their community. You know, I really don't think that. I think it's based on relationships rather than kind of holding up her place in art history, because it kind of, certainly when they were commissioning this, there wasn't a position in art history. It's slowly kind of coming now. And I think also, so Suzanne works in stained glass and is very kind of big in the stained glass community in Charlottetown. So I think there's an embeddedness within that community. And then in terms of younger artists, I think I don't know so much. I wanted to be really subtle about her inclusion in Women in Revolt, not because I didn't want to celebrate it, but because I didn't want it to be a big deal. I just wanted her to be a woman in the show. So I actually quite often had to point out to visitors, so especially when we had students, and especially when we were talking about things like Section 28 and about the kind of queer inclusion, I would always just mention the fact, because a lot of people didn't catch that. So I think it would be things like your project and future work, and you know, people like Juliette looking at the work again and writing about it and contextualizing and allowing that to grow, I think.
Did Erica also lead printmaking workshops for the communities?
Yeah.
That's-
So printmaking workshops, and I think
Yeah.
I get the impression it's a very small town. So
Yeah.
I think she was really the kind of key artist
Mhm.
working in the town. So I think everyone knew her.
It's very small, but it sounds like it's like very densely populated. It sounds like everyone's on top of each other.
I think
really
so.
like up in everyone's business.
Yeah, I think
Not
they're
one of it.
absolutely up in everyone's business.
Yeah.
And when I met Susan, I was talking to her husband, and this is such a small detail, but she had an otter brooch, and I'm obsessed with otters, they're my favourite animal. And they have a cabin that they hand built so that they could go and look at otters playing in a stream. And I was just like, yes, this is like
The dream.
this is the dream. Yeah, this is a good place to be.
Wow. That's fantastic. My next question is for Gemma. So as curators, we all have responsibility of showcasing the work by queer, trans and gender non-conforming artists in a sensitive and ethical manner that both of you mentioned. So I want to sort of scrutinize it a bit more. So sometimes I also had experience that we need to ensure visibility for the artists, but at the same time we need to protect the artists and protect the public, which you also mentioned. As you did at the Tate Britain. So how do you navigate this tension in your work? Do you have any practical advice in terms of like for probably emerging curators, any like things that you consider especially important?
I think it's such an important question and something that I think about a lot, and I think my thinking around this has changed a lot as well over the last few years and since doing the book. I, as a lesbian, have talked a lot about visibility and really kind of celebrate artists like Joni Byron, who did so much for lesbian visibility historically around in the 70s, around the time that Erica was making these early works. But I would say that the more I work with trans artists, the more I understand that visibility can be a really dangerous thing, a really complicated thing, and it's not a straightforward thing about we all need visibility. Visibility in terms of representation is so valuable to audiences and to people being able to get identification with work, but also to have artists who have defied the odds and had success or become household names. Someone like David Hockney as a queer artist, like I would talk about him being a queer artist till the cows come home because he's a household name. He talked very openly about being gay in the 60s when he was making etchings to illustrate the Caberfeed poems. He was saying this work is defending my way of life. A lot of artists have tried to talk about their identity, but it's actually art history that has refused to engage with that part of their work and their identity. Someone like David Hockney, who is a cis white male artist who has made millions of pounds from his work and is a household name, I feel like I have no problem kind of talking about his identity, but I definitely take a much more sensitive approach with different artists, and I would say in terms of advice, I think talking to the artist as much as possible. Of course, when we're dealing with historical artists, that's not always an option, and we can work with families and estates, but that's tricky as well. In Erica's case, it sounds like she has a very close and supportive relationship with her family, and they are advocating for her and her best interests. But there are lots of queer and trans artists who, particularly artists who died during the AIDS crisis, who, when they died, their work was lost or destroyed by the family because the families didn't want that legacy of the queer and trans identity to remain. And actually, the Leslie Lohman Museum, which Sonia mentioned at the beginning, is a museum in New York that I work with a lot. It's the only art museum in the world that's dedicated to LGBTQIA plus artists. And the museum, Leslie Lohman, it was founded by two guys, Charles and Fritz, and they had some money and had a loft in New York in the 60s, and they were putting on shows, and actually in the beginning they were doing like more commercial shows. But when their friends started dying in the 1980s, they had to start essentially saving works of art. And I remember that one of the first times, I think it was maybe the first time I ever went to the museum, they'd got a display of objects from the permanent collection. They have 25,000 objects in the collection. It's huge. Yeah, it's amazing. And I'm on the acquisitions board, and we're kind of constantly thinking about how we diversify the collection, because it was very much in the beginning dominated by white cis gay men. And we have, you know, the museum has sold, you know, maybe like where there was 5 Tom of Finlands, they've sold 2 in order to buy work by trans artists and artists of colour. But I will never forget, there was a piece on the wall in the museum that was a large crucifix with vials of medicine on it, and it, you know, really like maybe 3 feet tall, by an artist I'd never heard of before. That I think it was maybe one of the only artworks that anyone's got in a museum. And they told me this story that artist had passed away, and a friend had called Charles and Fritz and said, this artist has died, the family are burning their belongings in the garden, please can you come and help me save some of their art? And they went and they took this crucifix and they carried it on their shoulders through Soho to the museum, and now it's in the collection. So, you know, that's just like an example of like, you know, just thinking about like finding these artists and, you know, thinking about preserving the artist's work. You know, I think there's, yeah.
It's so interesting in terms of, I mean, I've left Tate, so it's, you know, not there anymore, but I was heavily involved in acquisitions, and exactly the same stories. So people like Tessa Boffin, you know, Sonal Gupta was looking after her estate.
Which thank God he did.
Thank God he did. But that was a really interesting conversation with the institution, because Tate used to only care, or most institutions used to only care about vintage prints and, you know, authentic objects, and trying to explain to them that actually you're not going to get Tessa Boffin vintage print, but we need these in the collection. Then trying to explain, and when I say them, I mean like the trustees, then saying you have to take Sonal's word for these facts, because Tessa's not here and Sonal is the person who's advocating, and that was such a stretch for the kind of the systems that we normally have in place. Yeah. And it's like, but you have to adapt, you have to change.
Yeah, and the systems that we've had historically in place have led to lots of museum collections of white men. Exactly.
Exactly.
So things need to change, definitely. Yeah, I mean, those Tessa Boffins, there's only about 3 bodies of work that she made anyway, because she was 33 when she died, wasn't she? So, you know, it's like, what is there is so precious. Thank God Sunil has looked after it and cared for it in the way that he has. But I always think about, you know, how many artists are there, and people that were making work who didn't have a Sunil Gupta as their Bezzy, they did a studio in the same building to look after that work when they passed away. And, you know, and also I think also about all of the artists who didn't ever get an opportunity to exhibit their work, or even to make their work. You know, there's so much to consider. I feel like I'm going off totally on a tangent.
No, it's all very, very useful, and actually it kind of leads to the next question, which it's kind of like a follow-up for Linsey as well, on the previous question. So Erica was on a very courageous but often solitary path, addressing questions like gender dysphoria, topics that are only now becoming gradually sort of part of the public discourse. And only now Erica's work is starting to gradually rise internationally, because you know, the discussions on gender are evolving as well. So so my question is, in terms of specifically historical work, how do you approach the creation of didactic texts and the contextualization of historical works, and especially artists who are no longer able to speak for themselves. And how do you manage the reception by today's public? Because obviously there is a question of language that is, changed as well this time.
Yeah, it's hard. We're lucky enough to have a very brilliant and receptive family in Erica's family, so we talk to them. But I worked for Women in Revolt with a brilliant interpretation curator called Sam, who is from like an ex-mining family and is a feminist and is very, like, her politics are exquisite. So we were already trying to really push the boundaries of what Tate could do in terms of its political positioning. We also worked with gendered intelligence because we didn't have the lived experience, so it was really important to us that we get everything kind of sense checked. And then there were they were very productive conversations. What was the second bit of the question?
The second bit is also how do you manage the reception by public, today's public, of the historical work, making sure that the important points are transmitted and received in a way that is, because obviously there is like a temporal shift in terms of language, in terms of perception, in terms of political and social context, which is going to be my next question more. But I guess it's a matter of interpretation.
And we thought very much about setting context in Women in Revolt. So each room had a panel at the beginning, and we really tried to be quite aggressive with them almost. So the first one was like, in 1970, you can't get a mortgage on your own, you can't get a loan on your own. There is no Equal Pay Act, there is no Race Relations Act. Lesbians basically don't exist in legislature. And we tried to really set that context. And then I think I'd have to reread it all again, but I think we were very clear where language was of the time. Yeah. Because the language is the hardest bit. It makes you like cringe every time you read, but it was absolutely common. It's commonly used terms that we just wouldn't go near these days. And so then for an audience who's like 18 or 19 coming in and seeing transsexual, they're like, what? Writing an angry letter, but you're like, oh. Interestingly, in terms of complaints, I got so much stick before the show about how much pushback there would be. Everyone was obsessed with the fact that there'd be like protests around the block. You've got to prepare. And the team were very happy it was a trans inclusive show, but they were all really like doom and gloom about it. And interestingly, all we got was some very furious emails, a collection of very furious emails. But it interested me that people didn't make themselves physically visible in the galleries. I thought that was interesting. Mumsnet as well. I always check Mumsnet with my shows to see. I just like to know. Mumsnet were not happy with Women in Revolt.
That's tragic, isn't it?
Yeah. That's really But it's interesting to keep an eye on what people are saying and where they're saying it.
We all want to know why.
What were they saying?
Well, I have something to say on that actually subject, because recently we had my daughter is 10, and there was a kind of preparation for a sex ed class that is going to start next year, but they gathered parents online to sort of prepare us for what awaits us, which was already alerting. And one question which was really kind of destabilizing and really tragic, because they said, well, we're going to talk about this in this way and about that in that way, and it was all kind of normal. But if kids ask us about trans identities, we are no longer allowed to comment on that, and that's the government prescription. So we gonna send them back home, and you're gonna have to reply.
It's like Section 20.
It is.
Exactly, and that is the new governance, and I think that's very recent. That's been updated only this year, or maybe last year, I'm not sure.
Because for the Tories.
That's something that they specifically alerted, like parents of, now, and basically that's really tragic, because not all families, like moms from the Mumsnet, they might have their own sort of way to explain and that's really, I find it
Yeah,
really
I mean, we have it.
tragic, isn't
I
it?
have 2 children as well, and I mean, I'm really lucky because there's lots of queer families in our local school, which sort of happened by accident. But we've had to. There's like a whole kind of group of parents getting involved, and the school has kind of asked for help. But there are, you know, organisations like businesses even that exist. Like there's one called Potman Ollie, I think it's called, and they help, they support with these like learning resources. But they and you know, some of the stuff that they do is as basic. You know, one of the first things that I did when my kids started in reception was just work with the school to make sure they'd got some children's literature that had 2 mums, 2 dads, single parents, grandparents, you know, quite basic stuff that really I would hope most 4 or 5-year-olds have got at home anyway at this point, but they definitely don't. But yeah, that organisation helps schools and provides books like that, but they are one of the organisations that get really targeted by TERFs actually, which I was so shocked to learn. You know, it's, as a parent of young children, it's really frightening.
It is. I guess that leads me to my next question. So, in terms of, again, to continue on the historical versus contemporary perception of the artworks, and especially thinking about this series, the human comedy that we're surrounded by. So, I wanted to dedicate some time to spend with these paintings and to reflect on them, and specifically like to think about the AIDS crisis that coincided with the creation of the series, because Erica started to work on those in the 80s, if I'm not wrong, and all the way through the 90s. The AIDS had escalated into global public health crisis in the 80s and 90s. And so that's when Erica embarked on this series, which also marked her return to the figuration. And we can see humans and animals and also hybrids of the two in these paintings. And they're quite oniric and quite surrealist. But I was really curious how, because I didn't find, also like there's not much that is written about that, but I tend to view historical works through the prism of important social and political events. And I'm interested in the forms of activism that we kind of like touched on before, and sort of also artists' right to opacity or silence, and forms of activism that sometimes might not appear as valid from today's perspective, like public's expectation. So I'm really curious, like to look at these paintings through the prism of basically AIDS crisis.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting question because the timing coincides. I think my read on these works, and I'll be interested to hear what Linsey thinks, because Linsey's got much more understanding about Erica's biography. But I think my read on these works particularly was about them being in this surrealism is about kind of these like hybrid forms and forms that are perhaps in some period of transition or in between. All the figures read as genderless to me, and I think as well, like at this point in her life where she's gone through a medical gender transition, she's settled and kind of found her life, it feels like it's this kind of experience that I feel like lots of my trans femme friends speak about, is that once you start presenting as a female, you learn a lot about the female experience. And actually, I don't know if it's in the exhibition text, but there's somewhere I read there was a quote where Erica had said, kind of commented on the irony of once transitioning, that's when she'd kind of realised how it is to be made to be feel inferior. Yeah, do you have it there?
The experience of changing from a man to a woman brings me face to face with the humiliations of being treated daily as an inferior.
Yeah, and that's I feel like that is the sort of, that just demonstrates the great irony of the culture wars, because I feel like trans women and the trans women in my life are able to teach us so much about feminism. You know, like Sean Faye's book, The Transgender Issue, is such a beautifully written, articulate book about how, you know, trans empathy and inclusion could help everybody just have a much better time in the world. And, you know, so for me, thinking about these later works, I feel like actually that is almost what's kind of being explored, is the sort of, I guess, the sort of more farcical elements of society, actually. But yeah, I mean, I think looking back as a curator and a writer, looking back and considering specific socio-political context is relevant, definitely. When it comes to the AIDS crisis specifically, I don't know how, if it's something Erica spoke about in the book, but, you know, Erica had female partners, 3 wives, I think, you know, so I'm not sure that she was really part of the gay community. I just don't know that how involved she would have been with the activism around the AIDS crisis.
Yeah, I think I don't feel like she was. I think she was a romantic, and I think she liked being a homebody, and I think there's a real sense of like the domestic and those these works. I was just going to read. It's a bit long, but I'll start. Now I have retired to the farmhouse, seated at an old pine table in my kitchen and warmed by a wood fire range. I look out over the misty fields towards the sea as the colours change to those of winter. The years of renovation has made it comfortable and modern without causing it to lose its period charm. And my constant companion is my pure white cat and blue eyes. She's so romantic. My painting has changed lately. Unquestionably, it is more decorative and richer in detail. I have deliberately ignored the criteria of the modern art critics and historians, convinced that only a defiance of their set principles can break through the avant-garde academism which prevails. My work has never been revolutionary, and I'm aware I'm not one of the giants of the modern era, but I believe it has a permanent value. I have followed my own convictions in my art as well as my life, and have worked towards values for their own sake. I have not compromised for profit. So like, I've always got the feeling with her that she was trying to create the best life she could. She like wanting to settle and have a cat and have a misty view out the window, and which I think is why I'm so drawn to her, because there is the kind of, you know, really sexy, really dynamic, really bold kind of moment in the 70s. But I mean, they are amazing. But she also just wants to hang out.
But I also think that's actually what makes it revolutionary.
Yeah, totally.
Just living, being, and existing. And
being happy with your family and your cat. Totally.
Because that's also like, that's the labor, no? For her, for like, it's much more labor, I guess, it's taking for her to establish this domestic life for herself, no? With her family, after years of transitioning and like, obviously, you know, gender dysphoria she's experienced. So yeah, I guess, yeah, we should not forget about that as well, like how much work it was for her as well. Just this kind of normality that she wanted, probably, that she craved.
And to have an active artistic career. You know, she was incredibly active, so she managed to get to a point where, you know, she was very successful with the work that I kind of handed around. That was really well received in the 60s, 70s. And then she'd, you know, gone off and made films and all the other things. But yeah, at that point, she's making the work she's doing here, and she's settled, and she's at home. It's nice.
Yeah, so I guess these devoid landscapes and sort of burning skies, I guess we can probably see these works more through the prism of humor and certain levity, especially considering like the established family life, and as well as like her like children books, illustrations.
They're very childlike.
No,
and
that's
that
just
feeds
adorable.
into what she's doing at that later period.
Exactly, and her training as a theater designer as well as an actor and a filmmaker, so it feels like it synthesizes all of that in this
Yeah,
series.
I think that makes a lot of sense,
Yeah.
thinking about theatre and cinema as well.
Yeah, yeah. Before we open up to the audience, I just want to ask you the last question, both of you. So as we're, in the gallery showing so many beautiful works by Erica, do you have one work that you would want to highlight and why?
I mean, I don't know if we're maybe going to say the same one. I love the startled model, which is that 1977 painting when we first come in the gallery, because that is from that moment in her life. She went her medical transition in 76, I think.
Yeah.
And so I think comparing the startled model to We Can't All Be Perfect, the one that we saw was the mural from 7 years before, I think having the startled model, kind of very stylized, an expression of feminine joy, I would say, but also I think this tongue-in-cheek approach to all of the work. I do think there's a little bit of humour there with all of it. She's I think acknowledging the pressures that are put on women that she's experiencing. Kind of, as I mentioned before. But I think that's a great work, and it's great that the gallery managed to get it and have it on show here.
Yeah.
I love this show, but I'm not going to talk about this. So the work that was in Women in Revolt, Tate are buying it, which is amazing. So it's entering the Tate's collection. So that has a special place in my heart because there's only a couple left in the world that are available. So
The bed or the stuff?
the bed.
The bed.
I don't have
the
it.
painting. It was literally two left. Again, all to do with me being so brilliant. I love the diver as well. That is like badass painting. But I think we should never underestimate her book of yoga for cats, which I think might be my favourite thing ever. And when she talks about it, she's so into it.
Do you have it?
I don't have it, it's out of print. And she also changed, she had a nom de chat, gorgeous. And it was Talia Katasanda. That's who wrote Yoga for Cats.
Wow.
So I think that's high up there.
Fantastic. Wow. Is there anything else you want to mention before we open up to the audience? Well, thank you so much.
I've never been to Prince Edward Island, but I almost made it once. Yeah. So I spent a lot of time in Vancouver and on the west coast of Canada. And if memory serves me, I think a boat, at least back then, would have taken approximately 3 days to get there. And I'm just curious what your thoughts are about that sense of removing oneself. I mean, obviously in the context of her life and her experiences, but I'm also, in a way, mindful of another artist, albeit from a very different perspective, someone like Agnes Martin, whose work, she has that very famous quote, doesn't she, where she says, turning one's back against the world or something, to the door. And I mean, I've never been to Prince Edward Island, but I've heard it described to me by friends who live in Vancouver as this really quite extraordinary place. And I wondered if you could maybe reflect on that, because you obviously are aware that it takes that long to get there, and whether how you kind of read that in relation to her practice and just her desire to live this kind of life which is removed. You have to travel there in order to get it.
Yeah.
Being an artist, I live in London for my sins. I kind of get that.
Yeah. it would all be conjecture because I haven't been yet. But I think it is about, she was able to settle in a way that was so comfortable, and I think that remoteness, that must be incredibly enriching when you just go, okay, this, like she's saying, I'm not the most amazing artist in the world, but like I'm good and I'm rigorous and I'm true, and like this is how I can sustain a practice that is true to me without kind of getting distracted by the other things. I don't know. I went to Joshua Tree a couple of weeks ago, and it was the first place where I've been. I grew up in the countryside, but I normally hate it. But I was like, oh, Joshua Tree, I get it. Like I totally get it. Something about the quality of the light and the quality of the stars, and just like, whoa. So I suppose, yeah, people, you just find that bit of the world that's right for you.
And I mean, it was curious to me also because I did go to Babyland, which it was kind of set up on one of, I think it's
Babyland.
Yeah, I know. It was it was set up on, I think it's Sunshine Island. Again, it's one of the islands just off Vancouver, and it's a place where a lot of the queer artists from this general idea used to visit.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And apparently I'm the first woman to ever visited Babyland. But there is something kind of curious about that to me. I mean, I didn't realise that Erica Rutherford had lived there.
Mm.
But the minute you said it, I just thought, gosh, this is so
Makes
fascinating.
sense. Okay.
You know.
So that would be interesting, like when I finally get the money together, to find out how queer that community was, because maybe I'm missing a massive part of the picture, and it was, you know, maybe it's like Salmon Creek Farm, and it's a big gay commune, and it's really exciting. I'd always imagined it as the north of Scotland, because that's where I'm from, and I probably shouldn't have been. I should be thinking more radically.
I mean, it's rude. It's called, I was told, which, you know, just kind of blew my mind actually, that you can walk along the beach and pick up moss agates, stones that have just been so worn by the sea that they're extraordinary. They're like glass. So I have this kind of vision of this place, which eventually one day I might get to. But I like the association you were making about this kind of strangely romantic, quite mystical place that she inhabited. And in that sense, there is a real magic to these later works, I feel, which I love. You know, I think they're just, you know, they're wonderfully sweet and exquisite. And yes, I think they do have that sense of narrative telling in a way that one might find in children's books, but they also feel to me as if they are just in their own kind of elements.
Yeah.
In a way, they occupy something else. I feel. I mean, they're exquisite.
I mean, actually, something that's interesting. Sorry, just about these works in particular that I was also thinking about is like a theme that's actually throughout her entire body of work is this relationship to nature, like nature, animals, and reading the essay. So there was a show at the Confederation Center in the 90s, like dedicated to this body of work, and I was reading the essays from that in the catalog. And one of the curators particularly puts like the lens is a kind of eco-feminist lens almost. Like the way he writes about it is like it's a kind of when you like see it through like a human non-anthropocentric perspective, because it's a kind of entanglement of the human and the non-human. This like our relationship with the natural world, like that's very much the lens that so it wasn't like really a gender lens that the curator took to the works at all. It was this kind of like ecology lens, and I think that's also something really interesting that kind of like does recur like throughout like this kind of fascination or like romantic relationship to nature. And
I guess that's why I mentioned otters earlier. In my
Yeah.
head there was a connection. It was like
Yeah.
the whole family like built a place where they could go to watch otters.
Totally.
Like that's, I want to go there. You know, that's a good
Yeah.
place
It's interesting.
where this would make a lot of sense. There was someone
Hey, so I want to ask you, all three of you, in the past 20 years, obviously we see a lot of improvement on LGBTQIA plus community to support artists and also like people in general in the community. But also we are having some major setbacks, like what's happening in the state and with the UK, a lot of like political issues, which is not some of them in the news, some of them isn't. And emerging artists, we have like friends getting emails from the galleries and telling them to tone down, to not be too political. And I want to ask, what's your opinion on that? That could help early career artists.
Never turn down anything because someone tells you to. Would be my one key. Like, no one should ever speak to you like that. Like, it's just, they shouldn't. Your work is your work, and if, yeah, that's wild. It's, the UK has been terrifying for a long time, and it's still really terrifying. And I think the very last thing that should happen is that work should be made softer to make it more palatable. I think people should be constantly talking about the things that are wrong. I just signed today there's a letter, I think it's on the internet now, protesting about Outset and their involvement with Tate. He says lots of people who've been involved in the Turner Prize, that one of the artists has been organising it, and I think it's really important that artists and people in our industry stand up and say what's wrong, because a lot of it's wrong. Sorry, I just should let
Yeah, I mean,
speak.
I couldn't agree more. I think that we need our art and culture to respond to the really challenging times, whilst also not putting pressure on artists to be the spokespeople for us, which I think seems to be happening so much at the moment. But I think in terms of advice for, you know, emerging and early career artists, I would say find your community and stick together. Like, artist communities are so valuable. That solidarity is just really, really key. But also, I think in terms of like one's own sanity, it's key to have that community and solidarity. But also, in a practical sense, you can, I mean, I was at a studio with an artist today who was talking about they're going to team up with another trans artist and they're going to share a studio space because then it makes it affordable for them. You know, I think in terms of practical things, if you have that community of artists and you stick together and you find those people whose values are aligned with yours, you can share resources and you can share opportunities with people. You know, the last art market report I read said that I think it was like half of galleries said that the main place they find new artists is through the artists already in their roster. So, you know, a lot of opportunities come from within artist communities. And then I think find those people in the art world whose values align with your own, whether it's curators, writers, people running institutions, and stick with those people and look to those people to help you with your, you know, facilitate your practice. It's such difficult times, you know, right now. I chair the board of a charity and we came under attack last year. It's very difficult. The Charities Commission puts a lot of restrictions on charities and what they can do. The Arts Council has sent some very mixed messaging over the last year. Some of it's been extremely destructive, as I'm sure everybody knows about. You know, it's like we are, you know, I've been in the art world for 20 years. It's not that long, but the challenges that we're facing right now are the worst that I've seen in my career in the art world, and I just think it's so important that we stick together and support each other and just really think about what it means to care for people in our community, because everybody, you know, everyone's having a much harder time.
May I say something? Sorry, I feel a bit shy, but I really think we have to bust the myth in the art world that artists can't be political, yet collectors can be.
Yeah.
It's amazing how many bloody collectors can say what they want, fund what they want, get their money from where they want, but the minute
And
as an
ruin an
artist,
artist's
you
career.
say
Yeah.
something, they'll ruin your career and
Yeah.
they'll put you on a list.
Yeah.
And that's a
Very-
myth
very
that
scary.
really somehow needs to be broken. Oh, but you're an artist, you're not meant to have a political opinion.
I've never, that's absolutely scary. I've never
you
heard.
get
Yeah,
told
yeah,
that.
yeah,
Oh,
yeah.
art shouldn't be about politics.
Wow.
Yeah, well, there's the whole the thing in New York with the list, the artist list.
What's going on in London?
But I'm certain it's problematic, and is it not that some artists are given packages, mainly male, while it's famous artists who are given permission to really to be who they are. But you know, it's not a kind of it's not extended to everybody. You know, I think it is problematic, but absolutely, I would agree with you. We've just got to keep going. It just makes me angry.
Yeah, the thing is, if I can add on that, like there is something in the system that doesn't work because, well, first of all, I totally agree that the burden of speaking up shouldn't fall on the artists. It should fall on the institutions that like represent artists or show artists.
They don't.
But exactly, but then the thing what we discussed in the previous panel discussions that like big institutions cannot do it because like there's too much at stake. Smaller institutions such as like Mimosa House or Queer Circle, like it seems like we're in a better position to have a bit more like freedom. But then like we rely on like state support, which means Charity Commission and Arts Council that again do not allow certain like statements to be made. And then the collectors as well, who like, because obviously we rely on individual donations as an organization. And then, well, like I'm coming out from this experience of curating transfeminisms and talking about like palatable, like digestible sort of subjects. That was not one of those, for sure. Like, you know, like when you talk about feminism and like something manageable, like the version of feminism that is more like, you know, on Instagram or like promoted by like brands like in fashion, that's okay. But once you kind of widen your scope in terms of language, in terms of representation, in terms of very complicated subjects, then it becomes like too much for most of the funders. And we did face situations when collectors were putting actually very clear conditions on their donation. So that's absolutely like true that they can promise you a big donation if you respect certain conditions. So in a way, you know, the system is screwed, no? Because like it's not even about like if we were to have 100% of public funds, but then even that is quite policed. So in a way, like how do we navigate that?
I think the only thing to do is like a total socialist revolution, so that you can, so that you can work 3 days a week in a cafe and have 3 days a week in a studio, and then just like our market's it's just wrong. It's just like to have all the focus on a few individuals. Like we all should be making work, and we should all have a nice time. We should all be able to eat. Like it shouldn't be all or nothing in the art world. It's like it's so fundamentally wrong and damaged. I think it just it needs like blown apart and put back together. I think.
And who are these artists who are doing portrait of political figures?
Who? Sorry. We're talking about like who are the artists making political work. There's lots.
Not portrait of lots of politicians.
What about? Sorry, I missed that.
No, they do portrait of politicians, you know, these artists. So they are political.
I think. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I've seen a lot of portraits of Donald Trump over the last couple of years.
Yeah, true.
Unflattering, I hope.
Yeah, mostly. I mean, the only ones I'm interested in looking at.
I have a question for you. Before you spoke about how Kate was very concerned about the perception of the shop, and I was wondering how much self-censorship
None.
there was in process, like
None.
from you now, but like was the institution trying to have some,
Yes.
or yes,
Yeah.
What were like, because I find that often, I mean, in my experiences, sometimes people are more scared than what actually may happen in reality. It's like that they will kind of self-censor more than what actually people will do about it, because most people actually will actually do nothing about it.
Yeah. I think the fears around women in revolt was that no one would come because they think it was boring. That was the biggest fear the institution had. Yeah. They were convinced. Alex told me feminism's boring. Feminism's boring. Why would we make the show? And so that was the mood from the senior team. And then it was really nice. And then the
it was so cash you couldn't even see the work.
What were visitor figures like?
double
Huge.
It was
Big
very
expectation.
feminine. That was what was so great. I took my husband, and it was really funny. I wish I'd gone with a girlfriend.
But it was interesting. But I say that, and I don't want to sound like some, like, oh, I'm so great, because so many of the people I work with knew that. It was like this level of bureaucracy at the top that were like, oh my God. And then everyone else was like, yeah, obviously, let's make the show, it's going to be amazing. So the vast majority of people at Tate were like super, super supportive. But there was still this sense that they wanted to mold it into that Instagrammable thing. So I had to hold every element. So like the poster, the fights I had about that poster, and like they wanted to sell. One of the things that was said to me when they showed me a poster and said, this is the poster we want, the marketing team. And it was for a different show. And I said, like, that is a different show. And they wait for it. They said, yes, but it's one people will come to. I was like, wow, okay. And so there was constantly having to go, we as a team believe in the show, we trust it, don't worry, it'll be fine. A lot of like keeping the atmosphere light and full of humor and being like, it's cool. And having amazing artists like Shitba who would advocate at every corner for the show and for, you know, what was happening. But no, we didn't censor ourselves at all. Within the realms of what you are allowed to do. So like I've talked about Palestine while being a curator of that show, because you're not allowed to be sacked, because they are not a political institution, they're the arm's length government. So there are things you just can't do or you'll lose your job. But in terms of the general stuff, no. But I was going to say something.
I visited the show with a friend that is a media curator, and I mean I really saw what Daria said before, about all the works that have not had the chance to be made. In the sense that I was working with him and he was like, oh, this is so great, look, these artists, they're there with because there were many artists that were from Britain that came with maybe family members who were taking pictures. That's so sweet, you know, like they have this recognition. And then, like, I'm an artist and I was thinking, well, really, maybe I'm wrong, but like, I kind of noticed that a lot of the larger works were made during their studies.
Such a good point. Yes.
And when actually
So
they came up, and I
many.
was thinking, like, this is the last time that this really talented artist had a studio.
Perfect
And after
observation.
they were making works this big on the bloody kitchen table.
It's a really important
And I was like,
observation.
and it made me really happy. I was like, okay, so these artists could be in Tate Britain now with a work that they made when they were 22, and they had no chance to make a work after that scale. While I don't know, like Monet made the show in Tate Modern with cutouts from a wheelchair at 90 works of 6 meters. It's like with fantasy and like that, which are beautiful. But it's really like, how do you even insert like what is the potential, what was not made actually? Because it wasn't a choice to make things like this.
No, for most people, of course it's not a choice. No.
Maybe they want to make a granite.
But it's then so interesting. So then those kind of conversations, I mean, this is why I've left, right? Because it's so frustrating, but also because I want to look at these from a different angle, these kind of questions. But it's things like when you're bringing in acquisitions. So when I started at Tate like 9 years ago, to get a work into Tate, you had to have a really illustrious exhibition history, which basically means you have to be shown in lots of places where other white men have been shown, right? And it's always these same criteria, and it's so boring. And if you brought forward a work where there wasn't an exhibition history, my experience was that 9 years ago you'd been laughed out of the room. And that has changed in the past intervening years. So then when we were bringing work from Women in Revolt and saying, okay, there's a 20-year gap in their practice, or there isn't any more work, that was being seen as legitimate and work was coming through. So I think things are changing. But it's a really depressing.
I think that observation about the scale of
Yes,
work
such a
and
good
what is possible is so fascinating. When I was researching for my book, there came a point when all my poor wife could hear me talk about, I felt like I wanted to throw my laptop out the window, because I was looking at all of these. There was a period where I was looking at US artists who were making work in the 70s, 80s, 90s, and all of the men have got, when you Google them online, just to kind of get a first glance, all the male artists who were involved in that scene, the ones who had survived, have blue chip gallery representation on multiple continents. All of the women, and I'm talking about really important female artists who've made massive contributions, like Harmony Hammond, who wrote a book about lesbian art in America as well as making her own work, or Tessa Boffin is a great example, or Jeb, Jenny Byron, or T. Kareen, all of these brilliant artists. They've all got a fucking WordPress site. Even now. And it was and they don't have gallery representation, but although that is definitely changing. I mean, Richard Saltoun, I think, is a really good example of a commercial gallery that does, as Sonny said at the beginning, work to support underrepresented artists. But, some of those artists that, are in the book, and lots of them, I spoke with them directly about their work and how we might represent it in the book, because it was really easy to talk to them directly, whereas the white male gay artists, it was going through 3 different people at whatever Thomas Dane Gallery, and it's just it was such a stark comparison, really.
And also a lot of people who are living with a lot of trauma from that time. So I don't think she would mind me talking about it, but Jill Posner didn't trust me for a long time, and I happened to be in San Francisco, and I was like, oh, can I come and see you, Jill? And she was like, well, why would you want to come and see me? Because she'd stopped working, because it was such a hostile environment for her. I mean, obviously she'd moved from London to Berkeley, and she'd worked for On Our Backs, and she'd had this incredible practice. But ultimately, she had stopped working because it was a kind of uncomfortable environment, and she started an animal shelter. And we then became firm friends, and she'd said, why didn't I just let you in my house? And it's like, because you didn't trust me, and why should you? Because there's, curators have been saying things like, they've said to you that you can't be political, or you can't be yourself, or you can't express your true self in this environment. So of course there's going to be...
Even that, when I was trying to get a copy of Jill's book, Spray It Loud, and it's like, you have to pay like £100 to get one out of print book. Same with this one. That's why I asked you if I could borrow 9 Lives, because it's like it's so hard to get
We have a
copies of
full
stuff.
stock of copies now.
Okay,
so
great.
We're good.
Okay, good.
We can let you on.
Thank you. But
Gemma and Linsey, what obligation then should the art market or the dealers or the galleries have to forging opportunities for young trans artists then to develop their work? Where is the space within the industry to actually foster new talent for underprivileged and under-resourced communities that traditionally have been ostracised or underrepresented, and therefore not got the same equivalent opportunities to forge their way moving forward?
Yeah, it's a great question. Thank you. I mean, as you know, for me, I think one of the this has been such a big focus of mine for the last year or two, actually, is thinking about how I as an individual can try and affect any change within that space. And I'm really lucky, I think, because I don't really have one job. I have about 50 jobs, and I do lots of different things. I curate shows, I write books, I also work with some collectors, I work with museums, and the last year or so, I have really, really tried to pivot my focus as much as possible while still earning some money to where I can find create opportunities for artists, particularly young trans artists. And so one of the things that I've been able to do, and I think that this is something that hopefully we'll see more of, is I get asked often if I will do art advising for people, and I usually say no, but if there is someone who has values aligned with my own and really does want to support women, queer artists, trans artists, and really cares about that, then I will work with those people. And so I have a few collectors that I work with, and the way I'm thinking about it with a couple of those collectors is, okay, finally there's a queer person here with these great values and the money to back it up, rather than just buying some work to, speculatively create some assets or whatever, because I know that these are your values. What could we do longer term? And so there's one collector I'm working with where we're thinking about a collection that can get turned into a private foundation at one point, and we're really actively buying young living artists. And then there's another collector, when we were talking about how much money was available and what they might like to do with it, then we did a couple of exhibitions together. I just said, okay, with that same amount of money, we could do a 2-year program, and we could do a couple of exhibitions, a couple of events, and some mentoring opportunities for young trans artists, and that's what we're doing. So I think that I think, you asked about obligation, and I think that's it's really tricky, because people don't feel the obligation, unfortunately. But I think where there are people who have got good intentions and do care about supporting marginalised communities, with the right support, that good intention can, I think, be focused in ways that has a bigger impact. But in terms of that being changed, the market changing and acknowledging what needs to change and what needs to be done to support those artists, there's so much work required, and I wish there were more people like us three, doing the kind of work that we're doing.
But we'll never be rich, so we can't.
Yeah.
So that's the problem. It's like rich people are generally awful, right? So it's like it doesn't.
But that's why when I find the queer
find the good ones, you're
really
like, come
good,
here.
I'm like, great, let's really do something.
Yeah.
I think the institutions have a big role to play in this as well, because a lot of collectors and commercial galleries will look to institutions to see what
But institutions don't pay a living, living salary. So like Jessie did a show at Tate Britain and was probably paid £1,000 or something. So it's like, I think maybe there's something about refusing things and doing less, and when an institution or a place asks you to do something for a ridiculous amount of money, just say no. I'm going to work in a cafe instead. Why should I possibly work for you? Why should you get my capital for no money? And then trying to, make labour proper labour by getting on the streets and campaigning in that way, rather than for an art world that doesn't function.
I do think that there are more and more queer and trans people who have got some money. Some have got lots. Some have got some money that could be used to support artists. But there are, because of the way the art market has been built, it's been built in such an exclusive way. There are still so many people that don't feel that the art market or the art world more broadly is relevant to them. And that was one of the things I wanted to tackle with my book, was to show a broader queer and trans community that, look, there's all this art about us. This is about our experiences, and this is relevant to us. So I think that, that feels like a small step in a very, very, very long journey of even getting people to think that, wow, I could buy art and support an artist,
But I think like one of the trickiest things with rich people and collectors is trying to persuade them that the thing artists need is time and space, because they're not sexy things. Like, they want something, but it's like, actually, we all know that you give an artist, a stipend and a studio, that's the best thing you can give them. But no one wants to do that, or well, the Paul Hamlin want to do that, but very, very few people want to do it. Cheers.
Yes.
See if we give you a fade out. Keep on for now. I'm going to give it a go.
They're making money off the work that they did. It's really nice.
I know.
How are you?
Yeah.
No worries. Amazing.
They asked me to do it.
Sorry.
That was
Thank you so
amazing.
much also for your comments. They were very, very So I work with an artist. She's from Italy.
I've been on the phone quite a lot. I did a conference. I was trying to get you to remember you going away on holiday, and I was trying to get you to chair a conference. Remember last year?
I wasn't going to holiday. I was going to go on a work
And then also I asked Patricia Lowe to get you to come and do that gig in Venezuela. Did you just go there now? Yeah. So I told Patricia to get you to do
Great,
that.
thank you. Yeah, Patricia and I we knew each other a long time ago, and it's been really nice to reconnect. We're doing a few things together now.
So I had a show there earlier
Very
this year.
specific, but it's also,
No, Luna. I had a show there.
In the Venice space.
Yes. March. It's the start of the Biennale.
And what was the conference you had asked to do?
It was a UAL research.
Oh yes, I was on holiday on 6th when we were talking. Yes,
I tried to get.
Yes.
You could only do the morning or the afternoon.
Yes.
He got the break. I spent the afternoon.
Oh yes, that's right. Okay, yes, I do know exactly where you are. That's all right to come in. Well, stay in touch and do something
I
else.
think I've got your number still.
Oh
actually,
yeah, you
somewhere.
might have.
Yeah,
Because we did, we spoke on the phone.
I'm glad you did the thing and does she look after you? She has like Patricia. Yeah.
Yeah, I sure am. Cannot wait. And you haven't gone out to holiday. Exactly.
Maybe I'll send you some of my song videos.
I would love that.
I'm doing a project at the moment where I'm doing anonymous interviews with galleries and commercial galleries in London around theatre treatment.
Have you done it in
No, this is just because I really hate commercial art. Also, this is just focusing on commercial art.
Amazing. Yeah. Congratulations. Sorry for being very indiscreet.
Session, honestly, all of you are brilliant.
I blush. Living legend. Oh, thank you, Linsey.
installation of the
It's
mic.
both our names going to be on the, is it going to be
What?
Victoria and the other person? Beyond all
I
of
was
that,
so
it's also the thing that is not engaged next to and the fact that it is just being that I can't stay next to it and say, I'm glad that this is like, but I see its place. And in the meantime, someone else because I wasn't genuine and authentic about it. Like, you won't get criticised, but I will.
So there is representation.
I love how much you love it. I love this. It's so funny. It's absolutely the 99
And she's got the poetry book also.
I love this connection.
These are so nice.
And it was the same concept.
Anyway. Of course you do.
Do you want me to tell India? You can drop India or Lord. Yes. No, thanks for telling me because I really want to. Oh yeah, I made a video, a 4-channel video downstairs. So I'll tell you.
Oh yeah, I'll let you know. So nice to see you.
We're trying to look for Gemma to see the show because she will do the
so lazy go out